Good morning, Spencer Christian Church. I'm really excited about our study today. It's one that you probably are pretty familiar with. It's the feeding of the 5,000, and as Mark records it. But I think there's some interesting things that are going on in this text, and we'll investigate that today. But before we get into the new text today, let's take a little bit of a review of where we've been. Jesus was in his hometown, which is Nazareth, and he was held without honor there. And so we saw that. So the people didn't understand who Jesus was. And then we saw that Jesus sent out the 12, and he basically told them that they needed to trust him. And then as he sends them out, the next thing that we see is this discussion about Herod Antipas and John the Baptist, and how that whole story came about, that John the Baptist was executed by Herod Antipas. And so that kind of ramps into where we are today. In chapter 6, verse 30, it says, "The apostles gathered together with Jesus, and they reported to him all that they had done and taught." So the disciples had gone out, and then we had that kind of flashback of the John the Baptist story. And then now in verse 30 today, we see this homecoming of what they had been doing. I just can't imagine how excited they were as they came back, and they really wanted to tell Jesus all the cool stuff that had been going on this journey that they had been on as they were obedient to him. So this whole thing, this whole scenario, this whole series of actions that we're in right now, I think is really connected with the identity of Jesus. So we're really going to hit hard on that today as we study it. So we saw last week when we looked at this question of John the Baptist and his beheading. And at the beginning of that recap of John the Baptist's execution, it says these things in chapter 6, 14 through 16. They thought Jesus was John the Baptist, had been risen. They thought that he was Elijah. They thought that he was a prophet, like one of the days of old. And Herod himself thought that it was John whom he had beheaded, had risen. So there were all these questions of Jesus's identity, who he was, and the people were mixed up on that. They were confused. Jesus had sent them out and promised to be their provider. If somebody is sending you out and saying, "Don't take anything, just trust me," you're going to want to know about who they are, right? So identity matters here if you're going to trust them for your food and your sustenance. But the identity is confused here, and their ministry is going to be confused, as we see. A good quote that I've recently found by Stuart Briscoe, it says, "The more you tell someone who they are, the less you have to tell them what to do." The more you tell someone who they are, the less you have to tell them what to do. So we're going to really dig in deeper on that, but I just want to lay that quote out there early, and then we'll land back on that at the end of the study today. So the question of Jesus' identity continues. The apostles gathered together with Jesus, and they reported to him all that had done and taught. And he said to them, "Come away by yourselves to a secluded place and rest for a while." For there were many people coming and going, and they did not even have time to eat. They went away into the boat to a secluded place by themselves. So this secluded place is a big deal. The crowds were so crazy, they couldn't even sit down and have a meal and do a recap on what was going on. So Jesus says, let's go into a secluded place. Secluded place is a big deal in the book of Mark. The Greek word for that is eremos. Eremos means secluded places. Some of your Bibles may say desert. Others may say an isolated place or wilderness. But it's all the same root Greek word, and it's translated a little bit differently in different translations. Mark 1 talks about this word eremos and it's talking about John the Baptist. John the Baptist's ministry was in the Aramus, okay, and so he uses this Isaiah quote when talking about who John was, and John was the preparer of the way for the Messiah. Mark 1:12 through 13 is the account of the fasting and temptation of Jesus, and Jesus goes out into the Aramus, into the wilderness for 40 days, for that temptation. And then in Mark 1:35 and 45, we see that Jesus is praying in the Aramus, and Peter interrupts and tries to get Jesus to come out of the crowds in his preaching to continue into the synagogue, until he was forced to go into the Aramus to teach, which he was how he was establishing his kingdom. All right, so that Greek word Aramus is used over and over, and it's oftentimes connected with the establishment of the kingdom of Jesus. That establishment of the kingdom of Jesus is rooted in the identity of who Jesus is. So 32 through 34 says, they went away in the boat to a secluded place, which is Aramus, by themselves. The people saw them going, and many people recognized them and ran there together on foot from all the cities, and they got ahead of them. When Jesus went ashore, he saw a large crowd, and he felt compassion for them because they were like sheep without a shepherd. And he began to teach them many things. So Jesus looks out, and this is just the nature of who our Lord is, who Jesus is. He looks out on this crowd, and he has compassion on them because they're like a sheep without a shepherd. Moses uses that same term as he's nearing the end of his life, and he looks out over the congregation, and he says, so who's going to be their leader, so that the congregation of the Lord will not be like sheep who have no shepherd? And God goes on to suggest that Joshua be that guy. So that's the way it ends up playing out. Again, in Psalm, we see that being used, and we all love this verse, this passage. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He makes me lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside quiet waters. He restores my soul. He guides me in paths of righteousness for his name's sake. And we're familiar with this passage, but he's pointing to the Lord is the good shepherd here. And then John, in the book of John, Jesus identifies himself as the good shepherd. I am the good shepherd. The good shepherd lays down his life for his sheep. He who is hired hand and not a shepherd, who is not the owner of the sheep, sees the wolf coming and leaves the sheep and flees, and the wolf snatches them and scatters them. He flees because he is a hired hand and not about the sheep. I am the good shepherd, says Jesus. I know my own, and my own know me. And the passage goes on, and it talks about the ministry of what this good shepherd does. In verse 17, for this reason the Father loves me, because I lay down my life so that I may take it again. No one has taken it away from me, but I lay it down on my own initiative. I have authority to lay it down, and I have authority to give it up then. So he's saying, I am the good shepherd, and he's identifying how the good shepherd takes care of his flock, and that's to lay his life down for him. So we're back over in Mark now, verse 34. And it says he began to teach them with many, many things. So that's the way he provides for his sheep. So 35, it says, when it was already quite late, his disciples came to him, and he said, this place is desolate, and it's already quite late. So they're out in the Aramus, in this desolate area, and it's late, and they're concerned for the people. And so their solution is to send them away. 36 and 37 is what they say. Go out and send them out to get something to eat, because it costs too much money for us to do this. 200 denarii, that's approximately a half a year's wages, 6 to 8 months of wages. So it's a lot of money, and they're saying we don't need to be spending money on that. So Jesus calmly responds, and he said to them in verse 38, how many loaves do you have? Go look. And when they found it, they said, 5 and 2 fish. So the key point here is the point that really lands later in the passage here, because later they're not going to understand the point of the loaves. It's going to say that, but the number is the the number of 7 is really important here. And number is a number that's connected to completion, enough. It's what was needed. And so Jesus sees this little amount and he says, that's enough. So the text goes on, and he commanded them all to sit down by groups on the green grass. They sat down in groups of hundreds and fifties. That kind of reminds me of that Psalm 23 passage that we just read a moment ago. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not be in want. He makes me lay down in green pastures. Oh man, that's so good. And maybe that's going through Jesus's mind here as he's organizing these people and having them sit down in the green grass. Verse 41, and he took the 5 loaves and took the 2 fish, and looking up towards heaven, he blessed the food and broke the loaves, and he kept giving them to the disciples to set before them, and he divided up the 2 fish among them. And then 42 says they all ate and were satisfied. They had enough, right? 5 and 2 was enough. 5 and 2 is enough for 5,000 if Jesus is in the equation, right? They were satisfied. Satisfied is an interesting word. We see it pop up in Psalm 107. Let them give thanks to the Lord for his loving kindness and for his wonders to the sons of men. For he has satisfied the thirsty soul, and the hungry soul he has filled with what is good. In Psalm 132, verse 15, it says, I will abundantly bless her, talking about Israel, her provision. I will satisfy her needy with bread. Her priests also will I clothe with salvation, and her godly ones I will sing. So Jesus, God, is the one who's satisfied, is the one that brings the provision. So we go on in Mark 42, 6:42. It says, they all ate and were satisfied, and they picked up 12 full baskets. So we started with 7, and now we have 12. 7's a significant number because it's a complete number. It's enough. And then we see this other complete number of 12. 12 represents a complete number connected with the people of God. 12 tribes in the Old Testament, 12 apostles in the New Testament, and they had enough for the complete measure of God's people. Is kind of the subliminal point, I guess you could say, is being used and made here. And there were 5,000 men who ate the loaves. So as we go on through the text here, it's important to look at the parallel passage on this one, and that's in John's account. It gives us a little bit of extra information. John says, therefore, when the people saw the sign, the feeding of the 5,000, which he had performed, they said, this is truly the prophet who has come into the world. So Jesus, perceiving that they were intending to come and take him by force to make him king, withdrew again to the mountain by himself alone. So the implications of this was huge. You have this huge gathering of people, and they're thinking, wow, he's the Messiah. He's the one that's coming to take this military victory. So let's make him king whether he wants to be it or not, is what's going on here that we see from the parallel passage in John. But Jesus is not coming as the conquering Messiah leading a violent military campaign. No, he's the king who looks out on his people with compassion and feeds them. And the way he feeds them is with his message. And then he gives a sermon illustration to that message of feeding the 5,000, showing that he is the one that can satisfy them. He's the one that satisfied the 12 and gave them provision when he sent them out. He's the one that satisfied his sheep here with the feeding of the multitude, and he's the one who satisfied his sheep, us, the church today. He satisfies that greatest need that we have, that provision that he offers of him going to the cross and making that reconciling act of the sacrifice that Christ makes on the cross to help restore that relationship between God and man. So the text goes on, 45 through 46. Immediately Jesus made his disciples get into the boat and go ahead of him to the other side to Bethsaida, while he himself was sending out the crowd away. After bidding them farewell, he left for the mountain to pray. So Jesus is going out into the Eramus, into the wilderness, to get away. He needs some downtime. and he sends the disciples out on a boat ahead. So we go on. It says, when it was evening, the boat was in the middle of the sea, and he was alone on the land. Seeing them straining at the oars, for the wind was against them, and about the fourth watch of the night he came to them, walking on the sea, and he intended to pass by them. This is kind of funny to me as I read it. You just kind of wonder, does Jesus have his hand in his pocket, and he's just kind of meandering by them? I think there's much more going on than maybe that comical image that we might think about in here. Why did he intend to pass them by? It says that here in verse 48. There's several verses that talk about that in the Old Testament. In 1 Kings, we see that when Elijah had bested the prophets of Baal, and he's kind of depressed because Jezebel's coming out and gunning for him. He goes up into the mountain before the Lord, it says in 1 Kings, and behold, the Lord was passing by, and the great and strong wind was rending the mountains and breaking the pieces of the rocks before the Lord. But the Lord was not in the wind, and after the wind an earthquake, but the Lord was not in the earthquake, and after the earthquake a fire, but the Lord was not in the fire, and after the fire a sound of a gentle blowing. So the Lord was passing by, that we see that in here. He was giving encouragement to the prophet that needed that encouragement when he was down and kind of tired. The servant needed encouragement, and he's going to give that encouragement by passing by showing them a glimpse of who he was. So that's what we can understand when we read that verse. But that's not how it ended up playing out. He didn't simply just pass by. Verse 49, it says, but when they saw him walking on the sea, they supposed that it was a ghost, and they cried out. So the tradition of that day is if you saw a ghost while you were on the water, your death was imminent. It was soon coming. The story goes on. For they all saw him and were terrified. But immediately he spoke to them and said to them, take courage, it is I. Do not be afraid. This would be better translated like it's translated in John 8:58. And when John uses that same phrase there, it's the Greek word is ego eimi. And the way it's translated here is it is I, but the way it should have been translated, in my opinion, is it should be I am. The same I am when Moses is sent to Pharaoh, and he says, who do I tell him sent me? And God replies to Moses, and he says, tell them I am sent you. Okay, and that's the same phrase that Jesus uses 7 times in the book of John. Again, that complete number, saying I am the good shepherd, I am the gate. And all these 7 I am statements. It's the same idea there. So they didn't understand who Jesus was. Look at this in verse 51 and 52. They got into the boat with them, and the wind stopped, and they were utterly astonished, for they had not gained any insight from the incident of the loaves, but their heart was hardened. Wait, let's just skip past the part where he just walked on water. The thing that Mark accounts for here is they didn't get the incident with the loaves. They didn't get that God is the provider, that Jesus is the good shepherd, that he's the one that sent them out on that missionary journey. He's the one that's taking care of them now as they strain and as they struggle against the wind. He's the one that can give them what they need. The loaves was not just some magic trick. The loaves is an illustration of the bigger point of Jesus' message, and that is who he is. He is the provider. He is the good shepherd. Verse 53 says, when they had crossed over, they came to the land of Gennesaret, and they moored to the shore. So they were on their way to Bethsaida. They end up in Gennesaret. Wait a second. We've been in Gennesaret before when the demoniac named Legion was liberated from all the evil spirits that were in him. And so that's where we find ourselves in our geographic location as the wind kind of blows us off course from Bethsaida. verse 54 said, when they got out of the boat, immediately the people recognized him. And they might be thinking, they had sent this guy off before. He's the pig killer. He's back. Let's run him off again. No, that's not what happens here. Verse 55 says, and they ran about the whole country and began to carry here and there on their pallets those who were sick to the place where they had heard he was. Wherever he entered villages or cities or countryside, they were laying the sick in the marketplace and imploring him that they might just touch the fringe of his cloak. And as many as touched it were being cured. So it's interesting here when we saw the end of that story of the casting out of the demons from the guy that used to be called Legion. They sent him out, but that interaction between Jesus and that guy was very interesting. The guy wanted to go with Jesus, but instead Jesus says, no, you go and tell him what I've done for you. And that was the ministry that Jesus gave to that former demoniac. He didn't say go and get a doctoral degree in theology and then go tell people. No, he just simply told them, go and tell them what I've done for you. And so now we're going to see the result of that. We see all these multitudes coming back, and they instantly knew who Jesus was because they knew how this guy had been transformed. They knew he was a lunatic running around and terrorizing the community, and now he's a sane person talking with them about what Jesus had done for him. And so what we see here, I think, in large part is the result of this ministry of one guy who'd been transformed by what Jesus had done for him. And people saw that, people recognized that. And so that sends a message to us in what we need to do. Because we are all just one person. I'm just one person, you're just one person as you listen to this today. And you don't have to have some doctoral thesis. You don't have to have some big understanding of Greek or some big apologetics training. You just need to show them the transformed life, how Christ has satisfied your needs and healed and made you whole. So when we see this story today, it's so easy to look at these stories and just think, yeah, that's a cute Bible story. I've known that since I was a kid. That's kind of the way I am with it. But no, what we see here is Jesus unveiling who he is, who his identity is. And he's saying, look, I'm teaching you who I am, but I'm not just teaching you, I am showing you that I'm the good shepherd, and I am providing for you, not just with food, but with who I am. I'm going to lay down my life for you, is what Jesus is saying. And when we really get that message, this doesn't become just a simple little Bible story, cute little magic trick. No, it's so much more than that. It's the unveiling of who Jesus is to us. And like I started off with, if we know who we are, if we know our identity, then we don't have to worry about how we act, right? So we need to go out because we understand our identity is rooted in the identity of Jesus. Then that forms and shapes how I act and what I do. So now I don't have to be told to not go around and run around on my wife. Why? Because I am a servant of the God Most High. And what Paul tells us in Ephesians is that a husband loves his wife as Christ loves the church. So my identity is wrapped up in Christ, even in my relationship with my wife, with my relationship with my employees or whomever that you have interaction with. That should shape and form how you act with them. And you just tell them what Jesus has done for you and share that hope that Jesus has as the provider, as our good shepherd. And he has provided for you, he's provided for me. And if people trust and obey him, he will be faithful to supply for them and be faithful to satisfy them too. So go out and spread that good news today.